Hello YouTube, Chris the Frugal Audiophile here, and welcome to my first review video in a while, and the first one since having my eye surgery. My eye is doing pretty well, healing is going well, but it is slow, it's just going to take time, but things are looking up and I should be able to regain some functionality. Enough about that. Today we are here to talk about this little guy right here, and it is not the tiniest amp that I've ever seen, but it is fairly small in comparison to a lot of devices out there. And this is the SMSL A12 desktop DAC amp combo. And this is a DAC and a speaker amp. So I want to review this guy for you today, and we're going to talk about its design. So basically, this is a 5-inch by 5.5-inch by 1.5-inch box. It weighs 382 kilograms. It is an aluminum chassis, so it feels quite good in the hand. It is cold to the touch. It feels sturdy. There's a decent amount of weight to it. And its look reminds me of the Fosse Audio Q3, which we have at church. And you can see here on the screen a picture of the two devices together, and they actually do match quite well. It would not make a bad stack to have them together. Now, the Fosse Audio is smaller. It also has a DAC, so there would be some redundancy there, but you could use them together because the Fosse Audio has an analog audio output, and this has an analog audio input. The A12 also has knurled aluminum knobs. That's what the housing is made of, so it also has those for the volume and the bass and treble controls. The power and the input switching are some sort of metal little triggers, which are pretty easy to operate. One thing it does have, as you probably saw in my little intro video there, is a very bright power light. I mean, you could land planes with that sucker. It is so bright. I don't even think that my video has done it justice, because in person it just beams at you. And so does the power brick, which actually brings me to the power brick. And here you see it. It's almost as big as the unit itself. It's not quite as fat, but it's a good sized power brick. I have seen bigger on other devices, but this is something to keep in mind. And this has a bright green light on it. And it's not on right now because it's unplugged, so that'd be weird if it was on. It actually lingers on longer than I expected when I powered it off. So that's kind of the design of the unit, and its look. It's a fairly straightforward, simple, basic DAC amp combo. Oh, and if I didn't mention before, this amp costs around $80 on Amazon. I got this one for $74. I see it right now. It's at just about $81. So it fluctuates around there. Really a competitive price for what you're getting with this model. So let's talk about its features and specs. So the A12 has an analog RCA input, as I mentioned before. It also has a USB Type A input. That is a full-size standard USB-A input, and they do include in the box an A-to-A cable. It also has Bluetooth 5.0. I did test it. It does work. Nothing special, nothing fancy. It's Bluetooth. It does what it's supposed to do. As I mentioned before, it does have bass and treble controls, which is handy if you have speakers that are a little bit dark or maybe a little bit bright and you want to tailor the sound to your liking or make it more neutral. You can do so. They do have a detent for the middle position, which would be just neutral. No addition or subtraction of bass or treble on the EQ when you are at the detent. And the A12 includes file support for MP3, SBC, WAV, and FLAC. Now, I was using it on my desktop with Apple Music set to lossless, and it was coming through just fine. So it must support ALAC in there as well. For output power, you are getting 80 watts times 2 at 4 ohms and 40 watts times 2 at 8 ohms. But what you have to keep in mind with Class D amplifiers, which this is, you're not going to get 100% power with low distortion. Once you reach 60 to 70% of a Class D amplifier's power, you're going to start to have 1, 2, 3, maybe even 10% of distortion. That's a lot of distortion. You will notice it very much in the audio playback once you start reaching the maximum of its output capability. So look at it as maybe a 60 watt amplifier into 4 ohms and a 30 watt amplifier into 8 ohms, which is more than enough power. As I mentioned, it is those new German Infineon chips. This is an MA12070 amp chip. If that means anything to you, then there you have the information. Doesn't mean a whole lot to me. But what does mean a lot is total harmonic distortion plus noise is 0.005%. That is a great number. And the signal to noise ratio is 102 decibels. Now, that's probably at a certain frequency, at a certain volume, but still, that's a really good signal to noise ratio. And I can attest that in my usage of this amplifier, it is a very clean sounding amplifier. Now, the final spec or feature or lack thereof is that this amp has no remote control. So this is really going to be a desktop amplifier solution. Could you use it in a living room setup where you needed volume control? Yes, but you'd want to get a DAC which has a volume control and which has a remote on it and volume control, and then you'd be able to use this amplifier. But there are better choices out there if you're going to do that. I would look elsewhere, but you could, if you really were in a pinch or if this was the only thing available, it's what you had to spend, you could use the analog input from a volume controlled DAC and then use it on a living room system or a system where you were not right next to it. But it's really its best use case is on a desktop, and that's how I'm going to grade it today. Which does bring us to the assignment, and that is to be an affordable desktop DAC amp combo solution. So how did it do with that assignment? Well, to begin, let's talk about what it gets right. First of all, design. I really like the design of this unit. It's clean, it's simple, it's straightforward, it's functional, everything feels nice to the touch, it's easy to use, and actually is quite enjoyable to use. The volume knob, it has a little bit of resistance when you turn it. It's not just loose feeling or cheap feeling. It actually gives you a little bit of feedback as you are turning it, as do the bass and treble, the EQ. They don't click except in the detent, but still, it kind of feels like you're turning it in honey or something thick, in a thick solution. It's not like the most resistance I've ever felt, but compared to what you used to get for a $70 amp, it's actually quite good. So I do really like the design of this amp. I also like its features. I like that it has a built-in DAC. That's just nice to have. It might not be the fanciest DAC out there. It might not be the highest of quality, but it is a decent one. It is a good one. If you want something better, guess what? There's an analog RCA input. You could add your own external DAC. It does have Bluetooth. I don't really need that, but it's there. Also, it has an analog input, as I said, if you wanted to use an external source, such as your own DAC, or if you wanted to use a turntable with the preamp built into it, you could do that as well. It's all there for you. So those are really nice features to have, and something you didn't get in a DAC amp combo of this price range just a few short years ago. Like my very first SMSL product was an SA50, and it was just a speaker amp with analog RCA inputs and speaker outputs, and that's it. Well, this amplifier has more features, and it sounds better than the SA50 does. To me, that's a big win. And finally, and I think what is most important, is that it does have a good amount of decent sounding power output. Okay, so yes, Class D does start to distort when you reach a certain percentage of the amplifier's capabilities, and that rings true for this amplifier. However, in my setup with my speakers using both the ELAC BS41s as well as the PSB Alpha A5s, I was able to get to about 95 decibels without any distortion on this amplifier. That is really good, and that was at about 3 feet of listening, so just around a meter there distance away from the speakers. So in my room, in my setup, that is what I was able to get out of this amplifier with clean power. So if you tend to run your audio at, let's say, 70, 75, maybe even 80 decibels, you're still going to have some overhead of clean power in your setup, which is nice to know. Now that is in my setup here using the speakers that I just mentioned. Your results may vary, but they're probably going to be very close, as those are two somewhat different speakers, with the ELACs being a little less sensitive than the PSB speakers. Now let's talk about what the A12 gets wrong. And the first thing is it's going to have your typical Class D amplification sound. For many ears, that can be a little harsh. I understand that. I get it. I hear that as well. Particularly in the highs, they just don't sound real smooth and natural. I mean, they don't sound bad at all, don't get me wrong, but they're not as smooth as they could be. So when I was listening to Sweet Arms of a Tune by Missy Higgins, that is my test track for harshness and sibilance, because her voice can be grating on a Class D amplifier. And with my older ones, it was almost unlistenable. With this one, I could definitely hear the sibilance, and I could hear some of the distortion in the higher frequencies in that song, but I could listen to it. It's not as though it was unlistenable, but it was definitely noticeable. And along with that is boomy bass. The bass with this amplifier, it just wasn't as controlled as I would like with both sets of speakers that I tested on it. Okay, so I was listening to I Can See Clearly Now by Holly Cole. You know, it's the remake of that Four Seasons song, and in that song, someone is playing an upright bass, and with a good set of speakers and a natural sounding amp, it sounds like the bass is in your room. I got some of that with this amplifier, but there was just some boominess there that made it sound like I was listening to speakers. It reminded me I was listening to speakers, and it wasn't quite as natural as it was when I was using my reference amplifier, which is my Emotiva A100. So I took the ELAC speakers, and which I'm really liking, by the way, that review coming up soon, and I plugged them into my Emotiva A100 using an Emotiva Little Ego DAC, and as soon as I did that, things just sounded more natural. It sounded more like I was listening to the performance rather than speakers and an amplifier. So that is a knock to this amplifier, to the A12. I will take away some points for that. It wasn't awful, though. I'm not going to sit here and say that it was just terrible and this thing sounds like garbage, because it does not. I really learned to enjoy it and think that it has a lot of value. I mean, when you consider that the Emotiva amplifier, when I purchased it, was $230, this is $70, so it's less than a third the price of the amplifier, and you're going from Class AB with the Emotiva and Class D with this. Really, Class D, I think, has come a long way, but if you are looking for audiophile performance where your speakers just disappear, you ain't gonna get it with this guy. And I'm sorry, I hate to say it, but it's just reality. Another thing I noticed when going from the A12 to my Emotiva A100 was that the sound stage opened up. When I was listening to Chocolate Chip Trip by Tool, it sounded like the instruments were far beyond the speakers, all the sound effects in that song. When I was listening to that, it just sounded bigger and fuller on my Emotiva. Not bad with this guy, better with the Emotiva. You sensing a theme there? However, when I was listening to Mango Tree with Zach Brown Band and Sarah Bareilles, in that song, Zach Brown is about dead center. And then Sarah Bareilles is just a little bit off to your right. So when you're listening to it, you can hear her voice coming from just slightly off of center, just to your right. I noticed that on the A12. So it did have those two voices placed very well within the sound stage. However, the sound stage was just bigger with the Emotiva and probably a little bit more accurate, although not a real noticeable amount. I don't know if it was 3 times better than the A12, but it again was better. I know you're probably going to say, well, it's your room. It's not the best listening room. And yes, my room is not the best listening room, but we all have to live in the real world with our audio equipment. And not everyone out there is going to have a perfectly treated room, especially probably someone who is looking in the $70 amp range. You're going to put it in your office, in your dorm room, you know, wherever you have a computer set up or where you need some audio, and use it there. Likely not going to have room treatments. So I test these things in a real world application. I do have a treated room in there that I can use for things, but when I'm testing this, I was using my office, which is probably not an uncommon room. So keep that in mind. Something else this amp gets wrong is quality control issues. Many have said that the power switch fails after a few months of use. However, I read on the Amazon page for this amp that SMSL has claimed to have fixed that. So maybe that's not going to be an issue anymore. I sure hope not. It seems like a solidly built amplifier to me, but just some were reporting that their power buttons would fail, and that has to probably do with the internal makeup of this amplifier. I don't really know all what's going on there. However, mine is still working fine. I don't really think that's a concern. If that's a concern to you, you might want to look elsewhere. Next thing I want to highlight is slightly quirky operation. When I would switch between inputs on the device, it would disappear from my computer. That however, is not uncommon with DACs and computers. They tend to kind of fight with each other a little bit, and when the device disappears, they don't want to switch back to them. And so that's not an uncommon issue. However, one thing I did notice when switching between bit rates on Apple Music, there would be this very loud and distinct whoop kind of sound. It sounded kind of that whoop, and then it would play the song just fine, but that sound was very startling and off-putting, and so that was occurring. However, I have not noticed that issue in the past week or so that I've been using it. Maybe something got sorted out, I'm not sure. Just something to take note of. It could be an issue with my Mac and Mac OS and Apple Music and this device. I'm not sure, but I wouldn't say don't get it if you have a Mac, because I've been using it for a week without any issues, but those quirks were there. Finally, the last thing that this amplifier gets wrong is a super bright blue LED. It is just so distractingly bright. Now, my eyes are a little extra sensitive right now, but still, it's quite bright. And not to mention that the power brick has a bright green LED on it. It's not as bright as the blue on this, but it's still pretty bright. So that can be annoying, especially if you want to use this in a place where you sleep. You probably want to cover it up with some tape. If you just want to tone it down so that you could still tell when your device is on, you could use brake light tape. That's a possibility as well. You can get that on Amazon. I'll link some down in the description. That needs to be fixed. I don't think it needs to be nearly that bright for us to know that the amplifier is on. So come on, SMSL, work on that. Maybe on the A13, they will have that all sorted out. And that brings me to my Frugality grade for this device when considering it for a compact, affordable desktop DAC amp solution. And I am going to give it a B-. It's a high B-, but a B- nonetheless. And you just heard why. You heard all the critiques I had of the device and all the reasons why I took off points from its overall score in the previous section. And yeah, I can't ignore some of those quirks. I can't ignore some of those shortcomings. I can't ignore that Class D sound that is common with these amplifiers. However, they are getting better and better as time is going on here. But it's still there. It's still noticeable when going from Class A, B to Class D, and you're going to get that with this amplifier. That's not to say that it is a bad amplifier and you should not purchase it, because if you are looking for a small compact amplifier in the $70 to $90 region, this should be at the top of your list. And that brings me to my recommendations for this amplifier, and I do recommend it as an inexpensive desktop DAC amp combo. If you don't want to take up a lot of space, if you don't want external DAC, if you want something that still sounds decent and has tone controls, this is a great option. You know what? You could pair this with the ELAC BS41 speakers for, let's say, $150 if you include tax and the cost of this amplifier. And you're going to have yourself a very nice desktop, I would even call it hi-fi audio system. It's going to kick the crap out of most quote-unquote computer speakers. However, if you're looking for something with that real true-to-life audiophile sound, you're not going to get it from this amplifier. Now, if that's what you're looking for, you are going to end up spending more. You can't really get that in a $70 amplifier. At that price range, you're mainly looking at, probably entirely looking at Class D amplifiers. So that's something to consider as well. In this price range, you're not going to get any better sound, I don't think. Maybe there's one out there. If you know of it, let me know. You're going to have to spend more money if you want to get better sound. That is always going to be the case with audio equipment. So just know what you're getting into when you consider this amplifier. And I will link down in the description some more audiophile type choices. Just remember, they're going to cost more than $70. So do you own the SMSL A12? What do you think of it? What do you think about its sound? Do you agree or disagree with my review here? So I thank you so much for watching this review. If you like this kind of content, please subscribe to my channel. Also, check out Patreon and buy me a cup of coffee. And remember, frugal doesn't necessarily mean cheap.